You feel it before you can name it, the weight on your life that never quite fit into ordinary language. The day heaven marked you, a seal was set on your spirit, like a luminous warning label, do not touch. Not a charm, not superstition, jurisdiction. And from that moment forward, your existence became a walking contradiction. You were attacked and yet untouchable, misunderstood and yet unmistakable, hated loudly but guarded quietly. Most people confuse being chosen with a highlight reel of miracles and applause. They don't tell you that anointing often arrives camouflaged as isolation, that glory wears the mask of grief while it trains your lungs to breathe at higher altitudes. They don't say that favor can make you a target before it makes you a testimony. But you've learned. You didn't go looking for power. Purpose found you and set off alarms in places both seen and unseen. Listen closely. When you were pushed to your edge, something invisible kept pulling you back like a cord tied to eternity. Plots formed, but their arrows evaporated mid-air. Curses boomeranged until the senders grew dizzy from their own venom. People assembled tribunals against your name, and yet inexplicably decisions fell apart in the 11th hour. That wasn't luck. That was divine protocol enforcing boundaries no human could redraw. You were escorted by a kingdom that doesn't need a press release to act. What touched others could not finish you. What shattered them reshaped you. And even when the storm pressed its mouth to your windows, it never gained a key to your soul. There's a reason your story never made sense to bystanders. Being chosen means living on a battlefield that doesn't always register on human instruments. You don't just walk into rooms, you shift the pressure in them. Your presence unsettles arrangements with darkness that people forgot they made. You didn't audition, you didn't perform holiness. You carried quiet voltage. That's why the enemy didn't rush you the way he rushed others. He studied you, circling like a thief who's realized the house is wired. He tried delays, not defeats, distractions, not destruction, because he understood something your heart took time to learn. To violate you recklessly would breach heavenly protocol and trigger intervention beyond his budget. So he opted for slow sabotage, confusion, mislabeling, betrayals that felt surgical. But even then, the blade blunted before it could reach your core. You bled, yes, but you never hemorrhaged. You lost things, but not your mind. You cried, but you did not curse your birthright. Here's the raw truth you're ready to hold. Some of the most devastating seasons of your life were not evidence of abandonment. They were evidence of rank. Your spirit carried a clearance level you didn't yet recognize. And while you were just trying to function, hell was convening emergency meetings wondering why you were still standing. You didn't flaunt. You didn't clap back. You built altars in secret, and heaven heard the sound of that private hammer, blow by blow, as you nailed your disappointments to purpose and called it worship. You weren't perfect, but you were marked. You weren't loud, but you were lethal to pretense. You didn't seek platforms. You became one, a place where God could land. They'll say it was coincidence that you escaped what should have ended you. They'll say it was timing, but your soul knows. There was a hand on the thermostat of your trials that would not let the heat exceed what would refine you. Picture a smith at the forge. Metal enters the fire not to be ruined, but to be rendered true. In the same way, your nervous system, bent and stretched by loss, learned a new rhythm. Deep trauma tries to fracture the mind, but it also awakens a vigilant intuition, a spiritual listening. Your tears carve channels where discernment now runs like a river. What the world labeled damage, heaven called data, intelligence gathered in the dark that now illuminates your steps. This is the divine mutation, pain transfigured into perception, survival upgraded into assignment. You felt strange for years, too intense for the shallow, too sincere for the slick, too awake for the sleepwalkers. But what if the strangeness was sanctified? What if your very difference was the evidence, not the error? The oil on your life refused to let counterfeits cuddle you into compliance. You tried to shrink your radiance to match the room, and the room still flinched. Not because you were arrogant, but because you were accurate. Your peace irritated chaos. Your yes to God sounded like a no to systems built on lies. Without pointing a finger, your very breath became a rebuke to the masquerade. That is why some could love your gifts, but not your gaze, because your clarity exposed the fog they preferred. Do not resent the seasons you spent hidden. Concealment was not punishment, it was incubation. Anointing matures in obscurity where applause can't counterfeit approval. There, in the untelevised hours, you learn the subtle grammar of the Spirit. When to move, when to wait, when to speak like thunder, and when to whisper like dew. You learn the difference between opportunity and assignment, between platforms and altars. Heaven turned your silence into a sheath, so your words would cut only when it mattered. Every closed door was a tutor, every unanswered text a boundary stitched by angels, every delayed promotion a re-aiming of your trajectory so you would not arrive early and bleed out on a stage that could not hold you. Understand this, you were never just getting through it. You were being set apart in ways your enemies accidentally confirmed. Their plots became prophecies you outlived. Their ridicule became receipts for the table now being prepared in full view. And as you cross thresholds you once only prayed about, you won't need to shout that God favored you. Favor has its own volume. It speaks by outcomes no smear campaign can revise. It speaks by the strange math where subtraction makes you larger and loss becomes leverage. It speaks by the way you can bless without bargaining, forgive without forgetting wisdom, love without renting your soul to anyone's chaos. Look back for a moment, not to drown in memory, but to collect evidence. Remember the night you thought your heart would split? The morning you dressed your hope like a widow and still went to work? Remember the betrayal that took your breath but not your future? You survived what designed itself to be your grave. Why? Because graves sit in gardens when God is writing the story, and what looks like burial becomes planting. The earth closed over you and hell clapped, but heaven was counting seasons. Roots went down, oil thickened, and now shoots break the surface where they expected only silence. You aren't emerging to prove anyone wrong. You are emerging because the time arrived that was etched into your journey before you knew language. Your suffering had a deadline that you did not set, but you did endure, and endurance has changed your posture. You no longer bargain with rooms that require you to forget who saved you. You no longer explain to people committed to misunderstanding. You bless, you build, you move. The same God who watched every hair on your head counted every tear you hid in your pillow. He did not forget. He does not misfile pain. He redeems it with an artistry that makes even your scars look like maps, roots of rescue etched upon your skin. So stand up, not in defiance of your past, but in stewardship of your calling. You are not the exception to mercy. You are its exhibit. You are not merely a survivor of war. You are a strategist forged by it. Walk as one who carries a spiritual do not touch, not to lord over others, but to live under God. The contradiction remains. You will be both arrow and olive branch, thunder and balm. Yet now you know the order. Presence before performance, altar before audience, obedience before outcome. And when opposition rises again, and it will, you won't panic at the sound of footsteps outside your door. You'll remember the locks heaven set, the windows sealed by prayer, the ring of fire you did not ignite but gladly inhabit. You'll remember that darkness can circle your house, but it cannot purchase a key that doesn't exist. Chosen one, breathe. The worst could not keep you. The best is not fragile. You are here not because the path was kind, but because purpose is relentless. And the same hand that drew a line around your life is the hand that now points you forward. Go, glow, guarded. They thought they were plotting against you. They thought their whispers could stain your name, their curses could cripple your destiny. What they did not know is that every attempt had to pass through a higher courtroom first. Heaven holds jurisdiction over your life, and the verdict has already been rendered, untouchable. That's why attacks against you never quite landed the way they intended. They got close, yes, they rattled your surroundings, shook your confidence, bruised your emotions, but somehow, mysteriously, repeatedly, they never delivered the final blow. That is what divine protocol looks like. The enemy can circle, he can roar, he can even swipe at your possessions or connections. But when it comes to your soul, your assignment, your very breath, there is a line he cannot cross. To violate that would be to trespass royal ground, and heaven enforces its boundaries with precision. What was supposed to destroy you merely delayed you. What was supposed to bury you became fertilizer for your rise. You may not have realized it at the time. To you, it just looked like confusion, doors closing, people vanishing. It felt unfair, chaotic. But in the unseen, there was a strange choreography at work. Plans against you collapsed midair, like paper burned by invisible fire. Curses thrown your way looped back, lodging themselves into the hands that released them. The very people who tried to push you down found themselves stumbling without explanation. You didn't retaliate. You didn't have to. Divine jurisdiction handled the paperwork. Think of it this way. The world operates with laws written on paper. The kingdom operates with laws written on spirit. When God marks someone, there is a spiritual legal system surrounding their life. Angels act as enforcers. Time itself bends to protect assignments. That's why you survived wreckage others never walked out of. That's why storms that leveled whole groups left you standing in the aftermath, shaken but intact. It wasn't because you were stronger, it was because you were covered by decree. Let's make it clear, you didn't earn this coverage through perfection. You weren't spared because you never made mistakes. No, your survival was never about performance, it was about placement. You were positioned in God's order, and order carries protection. Some people inherit kingdoms they don't even recognize. That was you. You were walking around thinking you were just ordinary, yet the realm around you treated you like royalty. While you were busy trying to heal and fit in, hell was holding crisis meetings asking why they couldn't eliminate you. Psychologists have a term for near-miss experiences. The car crash that almost happened, the disease that almost spread, the opportunity that almost failed. Survivors often walk away calling it chance. But you know better. Those near misses were not luck. They were surveillance reports, evidence that forces were trying but failing to touch what heaven had already locked. You've lived through too many almosts to dismiss it as coincidence. Almost broke, almost destroyed, almost abandoned beyond repair, but almost never became over. And that's what unsettled your enemies most. They couldn't figure out why every setup backfired, why betrayal left you wounded but not wiped out, why you disappeared for a season only to return sharper, brighter, harder to touch. To them, it looked like resilience. But resilience doesn't explain curses that reverse, storms that stall, plots that collapse. That's not resilience, it's jurisdiction. They weren't just fighting you, they were bumping into a protocol that outranked them. And the truth is, this jurisdiction has always been around you. Even in childhood, when bullies tried to break your spirit but somehow your laughter survived. Even in young adulthood, when heartbreak should have splintered your trust forever, but instead carved deeper compassion. Even in the nights you begged for release, when despair pressed heavy on your chest, but dawn still found you breathing. All of it, the delays, the near misses, the strange escapes, was proof that your life has never belonged to random chance. It is humbling to realize that you've been walking under a crown you didn't even know you wore. But that's the nature of true anointing. It doesn't need announcement. It doesn't need stage lights. It radiates quietly, unsettling what is false, repelling what is destructive. And though others may mock, misunderstand, or mishandle you, the truth remains. You are under divine jurisdiction, which means the final word on your destiny will never come from your enemies, your critics, or even your own fears. It comes from the one who stamped his seal over you before you ever drew breath. the one who wrote "do not touch" across your spirit, not as a suggestion, but as law. And law in heaven does not bend for bitterness, betrayal, or even hell itself. So remember this the next time confusion rises, when opposition forms, when betrayals cut deeper than reason. Remember the pattern. Remember how many times the weapon formed yet could not finish. And let that truth anchor you. You are living proof that divine jurisdiction is real. You've been spared not just for survival, but for assignment. And as long as that assignment remains, no opposition, no curse, no betrayal will ever have the final word. There is a mystery about sacred things. They often arrive wrapped in ordinary packaging. People expect glory to come with golden robes and loud announcements, but heaven's treasures often walk in disguised as fragile human beings. That was you. You stepped into certain lives not just as a friend, partner, or family member, but as an answer, an intersection point with grace. Yet because you did not shine in the way they imagined, they treated you as common. They mishandled sacred territory without realizing the cost. When people disrespect something holy, they do not simply lose the relationship. They lose the covering that came with it. At first, they may not notice. Life continues, laughter still echoes, plans still unfold. But over time, a strange absence begins to gnaw. The peace they once felt near you becomes restless silence. The favor that seemed to follow them quietly evaporates. The breakthroughs they expected stall at the threshold. It's not superstition, it's spiritual economics. What they mocked, they forfeited. Think back. You weren't just offering companionship. You carried alignment. When they were near you, doors opened more easily. Their hearts felt steadier. Even their households carried an atmosphere of calm. And yet, instead of honoring that, they minimized it. They thought they could toy with you, discard you, even betray you. What they failed to see is that by doing so, they weren't just mishandling you. They were mishandling God's deposit inside you. There's a sobering truth here. Heaven sometimes tests people not with suffering, but with blessings in disguise. How will they treat the gift they cannot quantify? Will they honor the lifeline that doesn't look glamorous? Too often, the answer is arrogance. People mistake humility for weakness. They confuse your patience for permission. They think your silence means insignificance. But the reality is that they were standing in the presence of something consecrated, and they mocked it. The consequence is not immediate lightning or dramatic collapse. Instead, it unfolds like erosion. Slowly, regret seeps into their nights. Relationships unravel. Peace grows scarce. The same doors that once swung open with ease now creak shut in their faces. And somewhere in the quiet, they trace the turning point back to you. Back to the moment they dismissed the very presence that was protecting them. Imagine a lamp in a dark room. People don't always notice the light until it flickers out. Then suddenly shadows rush in and the absence is undeniable. That's what happened when they mishandled you. Your presence was light, stabilizing, and subtle, but once gone, the darkness spoke louder than you ever could. Consider a case. Someone walked with you during their season of transition. They were unstable, anxious, doubtful. But while you stood beside them, they experienced unusual clarity. Decisions felt lighter, paths seemed straighter. They assumed it was their own strength, so when pride whispered, they distanced themselves. Yet almost immediately confusion returned, doors jammed, and they realized, too late, that the peace had been borrowed from your covering. This is why regret is heavier than loss. Loss can be blamed on chance, timing, or fate, but regret whispers, this was preventable. You mishandled what was sent to bless you. That is the torment they now live with. Not simply that you're gone, but that they squandered territory as if it were disposable. The scripture says, do not cast your pearls before swine. Not because pearls lose value, but because swine cannot recognize their worth. That is what played out in your story. You were pearl, but to untrained eyes you looked like common stone. Only after they trampled you did they realize what they had shattered. But here is the redemptive turn. Their mishandling does not reduce your sacredness. You are still who you were, divinely marked, covered, and aligned. Their failure to recognize does not nullify your identity. If anything, it confirms it. For only holy things carry such weight that mishandling them provokes regret that lingers long after the relationship ends. So hold your head high. You are not disposable. You are not replaceable. You are sacred ground. And those who could not honor that will carry their regret like a mirror they cannot escape. Not because you curse them, but because heaven enforces respect for what it consecrates. You were not just a chapter in their life. You were a lifeline. And while they may never admit it aloud, deep inside they know, in losing you, they lost far more than a person. They lost favor. They lost peace. They lost alignment with the very order that was trying to lift them higher. That is the weight of mishandling the sacred, and that is why regret now follows them like a shadow. There is a strange irony in your journey. You were such a threat to the kingdom of darkness that even hell had to handle you with caution, not because the enemy pitied you, not because he respected you, but because he knew attacking you recklessly would cause more damage to his own empire than leaving you standing. You carried something on your life that could not be explained, imitated, or defeated. And so, instead of an open strike, the enemy rewrote his entire playbook around you. Think about it. Some people were hit hard and never recovered. Their minds snapped under pressure. Their hearts grew cold. Their destinies collapsed under weight they couldn't carry. But when it came to you, the attacks always seemed strange. Betrayals came out of nowhere. Opportunities disappeared just as you were about to step in. Friends shifted into enemies overnight, yet through it all, something never allowed the destruction to finish its course. You were bruised but never broken, slowed but never stopped. This is because your assignment was too valuable to eliminate. Heaven had marked you for impact, and hell knew it. To strike you directly would have awakened reinforcements it couldn't afford. Every chosen one carries a kind of insurance policy, a clause written in their destiny that says, if touched too far, divine intervention is triggered. The enemy knows this, and so he often chooses subtle sabotage instead of outright war, distraction instead of death, confusion instead of collapse. It wasn't random when doors slammed shut. It wasn't coincidence when trusted allies turned against you. It was all part of a calculated strategy, not to destroy you, but to delay you. The devil's goal was to drain your energy, to tire you out, to keep you second-guessing your worth until you silenced yourself. Because if he couldn't kill your calling, he hoped he could convince you to bury it yourself. Yet even in the fog, the covering never lifted. You felt abandoned, but heaven never moved. You wept in silence, but your prayers were intercepted and amplified in courts higher than you imagined. You thought you were forgotten, but in reality, you were being studied, watched by both heaven and hell, as proof that God's seal cannot be undone. Let me paint it plainly. You were walking dynamite wrapped in clay. Every room you entered carried a tremor. Conversations shifted, invisible chains broke. Even when you spoke casually, your words sliced atmospheres. You were an earthquake disguised as a person, and hell knew it. That's why the pressure around you often escalated without warning, because darkness feared the shift you carried. But notice the pattern. No matter how intense the battle, there was always a limit. Attacks came close, but never finished. You lost things, yes, but never your soul. You felt exhaustion, but never annihilation. You faced betrayals, but never total abandonment. That was divine restriction at work. Heaven drawing a boundary line, this far, no further. And here's the revelation. Once you wake up to who you truly are, delay loses its grip. The enemy's last weapon is confusion. If you can be convinced you're ordinary, you'll live below your authority. But the moment you recognize your calling, his strategies crumble. Because no distraction, no manipulation, no betrayal can erase what God inscribed into your DNA before time began. Your life is living evidence that purpose cannot be erased. only resisted. And resistance, in the end, only strengthens. What they meant for harm trained your discernment. What they hoped would silence you sharpened your voice. What they planned as humiliation became preparation. You did not just survive interference, you learned to interpret it. And that interpretation is dangerous to darkness, because now you can spot the patterns, call them by name, and keep moving without collapse. Remember this: hell didn't leave you untouched because you weren't worth the effort. Hell left you untouched because you were too costly to fight. Your assignment carried so much weight that even demons had to step carefully, knowing that a wrong move would trigger heavenly backup. That is not weakness, that is rank. And now that you are awake, there is no disguise, no distraction, no delay that can mute what was always written over your life. You weren't just preserved, you were preserved on purpose. And now the preservation itself has become your power. They thought silence meant defeat. They assumed your absence was permanent, that your quiet seasons proved their schemes had worked. What they didn't understand is that destiny doesn't collapse, it incubates. Being chosen does not mean every path is straight. It means that even detours, delays, and detainments get absorbed into the plan. Your calling was never canceled. It was being refined in fire. When they dragged your name through the mud, when betrayal cut deeper than words, when opportunities slipped through your fingers, it looked like the end. But endings in the hands of Shemad are always transformations in disguise. While they were laughing, you were learning. While they were mocking, you were molting. While they were celebrating your silence, heaven was sharpening your voice for a moment they couldn't see coming. Destiny has a strange way of working. It is not fragile, not easily derailed. Like molten metal, it requires heat to reveal its purity. That's what your dark seasons were, the furnace. The fire stripped illusions, burned away dependencies, and melted the false scaffolding you leaned on. Pain pressed you until impurities surfaced, and though you wept in the process, the result was clarity. Authority forged under pressure cannot be counterfeited. Think of gold refined in flame. At first it looks ruined, contorted, broken, stripped of shape, but every second in the furnace brings out the brilliance hidden beneath. That was you. Every sleepless night, every lonely prayer, every moment of collapse was not waste. It was the fire preparing you for weight your unrefined self could not have carried. Delay is deceptive. It makes you believe the promise has expired. It whispers that God has forgotten, that the enemy has won. But delay is not denial. Delay is an altar where endurance is born. In the hidden time, your faith was stretched beyond comfort. Your heart learned to pray without witnesses. Your spirit discovered that resilience is not stubbornness. It is surrender laced with trust. And when the set time arrived, you emerged. Not bitter, but better. Not fragile, but forged. They looked at you and couldn't understand. How could someone who disappeared return stronger? How could someone they thought buried come back brighter? They misread silence as defeat when it was strategy. They mistook absence for weakness when it was consecration. Psychologists speak of post-traumatic growth, the phenomenon where suffering doesn't just wound, it produces deeper wisdom, resilience, and empathy. That's your story. Trauma tried to shrink you, but instead it carved you into a vessel large enough to carry purpose. You didn't just bounce back, you expanded. The cracks they left in you became channels where anointing now flows. And here lies the mystery. Every delay they orchestrated became the very thing that positioned you. Had you arrived earlier, your character might have cracked under the weight of destiny. Had you broken through without refinement, the platform could have crushed you. Instead, the delay ensured your foundation was deep enough to hold what was coming. Now your return is not simply survival. It is elevation. You don't walk as the wounded one anymore. You walk as the refined one, carrying scars that are not shame, but signatures. Each mark says, "What tried to end me became my evidence." You carry receipts not of defeat, but of divine preservation. And the ones who thought they won? They watch in silence now, not knowing whether to feel regret, confusion, or fear, because your resurrection has exposed their failure. They didn't just fail to stop you, they helped shape you. Their schemes became the chisels heaven used to carve your authority. Their betrayal became the pressure that birthed discernment. Their laughter became the background noise to your transformation. This is why you can stand today and declare with authority, delay does not equal denial. The fire was never for your destruction, it was for your preparation. The furnace forged you into someone hell cannot intimidate. Betrayal cannot unravel, and fear cannot silence. So walk boldly. You are not behind schedule. You are right on time, refined, redefined, and realigned. The delay was divine, and now the authority you carry cannot be imitated, cannot be taken, and cannot be stopped. You never had to swing a sword to start a battle. Your very presence was enough. Without saying a word, without raising your voice, you carried a light that forced masks to crack and shadows to scatter. People claimed you were too much, that you had changed, that you thought yourself above them, but the truth is simpler and more unsettling. You became a mirror, and mirrors make people uncomfortable when they're not ready to see their own reflection. That's why hostility toward you often made no sense. You didn't compete, you didn't brag, you didn't chase attention. Yet you triggered envy that burned like acid. Backhanded compliments, sudden distance, secret rivalries. These were symptoms of people seeing themselves too clearly in your reflection. Your authenticity revealed their pretense. Your peace highlighted their chaos. Your faith exposed their empty performances. It wasn't that you attacked them, it was that you reminded them of the selves they had buried. This is the paradox of light. It does not need to accuse, it simply shines. But in shining, it reveals everything hidden in the dark. That's why demons were restless in your company. Your frequency disrupted the illusions they depended on. Lies lost their power near your honesty. Pretend confidence collapsed under the weight of your grounded presence. Even silence around you felt like interrogation. You didn't try to expose them, but your healing made their avoidance obvious. Consider this. Many of those who envied you didn't envy what you had. They envied who you were. They could buy possessions, fake charisma, even imitate success. But they couldn't counterfeit authenticity. They couldn't fabricate the kind of wholeness that radiates without advertisement. And that made you dangerous, not because you tried to be, but because you existed as proof that something real was still possible. It's human nature to feel discomfort in front of truth. Psychologists call it cognitive dissonance, the tension when one's actions and inner reality don't align. Being near you amplified that dissonance. You didn't speak condemnation, but your life convicted. You didn't judge them, but your choices whispered what theirs concealed. And so, to escape the discomfort, they chose the easier route. They turned you into the problem. They accused you of arrogance when you were simply confident in grace. They said you'd changed when in fact you'd healed. They labeled your glow pride because their shadows could not coexist with it. In reality, they weren't fighting you. They were fighting the reflection you activated in them. You became the battlefield where their own denial screamed for survival. This is why some couldn't love you properly. Love requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires facing what the mirror shows. Instead of letting your presence inspire them to grow, they turned their discomfort into resentment. They tried to dim your light, not realizing that light cannot be contained. It either shines or it leaves. And so you left, not out of bitterness, but out of necessity. The irony is this: they thought you were toxic when in truth, it was their unhealed wounds suffocating in your atmosphere. They thought distance would protect their peace, but distance only protected their denial. And now, in the quiet, they replay the memory of your presence. Not because they miss your voice alone, but because deep down they know they miss the clarity you carried. Understand this: your presence was never meant to destroy. It was meant to illuminate. But when people are committed to their shadows, illumination feels like war. You didn't hurt them. You simply made hiding impossible. And so they fled, blaming you for the reflection they could not face. But here's the revelation: a mirror is never responsible for the discomfort it causes. Its only job is to reveal. And that's your role in this world. You are a mirror, chosen to reflect truth, chosen to embody authenticity, chosen to disrupt illusions without apology. Some will run, some will resent, but others, the ones ready for transformation, will look, weep, and change. So never shrink your reflection. Never dim your light to soothe fragile shadows. You are not their enemy. You are their opportunity. And if they cannot face the mirror today, the memory of your presence will remain with them until the day they finally decide to see. You weren't just a friend, a companion, or a passing presence. You were an exit. God positioned you in certain lives as a door, a way out of cycles they swore they wanted to escape. You carried healing they had prayed for, wisdom they lacked, clarity they secretly longed for. But when the time came to step through, they slammed the door shut, not because they didn't recognize the opportunity, but because freedom is frightening when pain has become home. That's the paradox of bondage. People beg for release while clutching their chains. Trauma, dysfunction, and old wounds become familiar, and familiarity masquerades as safety. You offered a path into the unknown, a life of growth, accountability, and light. But growth requires surrender, and surrender requires letting go of the very things that had defined them for years. Rather than risk transformation, they rejected the exit you embodied. And because your presence brought light, their shadows grew restless. Light exposes. It highlights the cracks, the lies, the coping mechanisms they depended on. You didn't come to shame them, you came to heal. But healing often feels like confrontation, and they weren't ready for confrontation. So instead of walking toward freedom, they labeled you the problem. Think of Israel in the wilderness. They were delivered from slavery but longed for Egypt, because bondage, though brutal, was familiar. That's what happened with them. They chose their chains over the freedom you represented. You showed them possibility. They chose predictability. You offered transformation. They clung to dysfunction dressed as identity. And yet, here's the heartbreak. You didn't just represent freedom for them. You were fighting for it. You prayed prayers that shielded them from storms they never knew were near. You carried weight that was never yours just to help lighten their load. You stood in spiritual battle on their behalf while they mocked the very covering protecting them. You weren't simply a door, you were a lifeline, and they cut it willingly. But the consequences are not abstract. When they walked away from you, they walked back into the very cycles they cried about. Their nights remain restless. Their relationships still fracture. Their dreams still stall. Not because you cursed them, but because they rejected what was sent to heal them. The opportunity they missed now haunts them, a silent echo that whispers, "You had a way out, and you refused it." And the most sobering part? They weren't rejecting you as a person. They were rejecting what you triggered in them, the realization that change was possible but costly. They wanted the blessing without the transformation, the healing without the honesty, the elevation without the surrender. And since your presence demanded all of it, they pushed it away. Now they replay the choice in quiet moments. They remember the calm that followed your prayers, the insight that came from your words, the unexplainable peace in your company. And though pride may never let them admit it, deep down they know they slammed the door on freedom. They crucified the cure. But hear this, you are not to carry guilt for their refusal. You did your part. You stood in the gap. You held the light. You offered the way out. Their chains were never yours to wear. And if they choose bondage over breakthrough, that is their decision, not your failure. You were sent to be the exit. Some will walk through, others will walk away. But either way, your assignment stands. You carry freedom in your steps, and you will continue to offer it to those who are ready. For those who reject it, their regret will become their teacher. And for you, their rejection becomes confirmation. You were never ordinary. You were always a doorway. When you were at your lowest, they didn't extend a hand. They extended ridicule. Your tears became entertainment. Your struggles were whispered about in group chats. Your name passed around like a punchline. Some pretended to care in public, but their smirks in private betrayed them. They thought your pain was proof that you were finished. They thought your breakdown was the end of your story. But God was watching. Heaven doesn't overlook cruelty. It records it. Every laugh at your expense, every fake check-in, every gleeful whisper when you stumbled, it was all noted. And while you sat in silence fighting for your soul, they thought they were safe in their mockery. But the tables have turned. Now you are rising, and not quietly. Your glow is undeniable, your growth unstoppable, your presence unignorable, and the ones who once mocked you, their voices have gone silent, not because they're mature, but because shame has stolen their speech. They cannot clap for you because to acknowledge your rise would be to admit their failure. They cannot even say your name without choking on guilt. Their silence isn't strength, it's punishment. This is the law of divine reversal. Those who laughed at your wounds must now watch your healing. Those who mocked your scars must now sit in the audience of your resurrection. And no matter how hard they try to ignore it, your very existence has become a sermon they cannot mute. But here's the deeper truth. Your suffering always had an expiration date. You wondered why, in one season, everything seemed to collapse at once. Betrayal stacked on betrayal. Opportunities evaporated. Confusion roared louder than clarity. It wasn't random. It was hell's panic. The enemy sensed the shift before you did. He knew your deliverance was near. And so he unleashed everything at once, hoping the final stretch would break you. Pressure is often greatest at the threshold. Ask any runner, the last 10 meters of the race burn the most, not because you're weak, but because the finish line is close. That was you. The spiritual warfare intensified not because you were failing, but because you were about to cross over. Darkness knew once you recognized your authority, once you stepped into your full identity, its access to you would be severed forever. And so the attacks multiplied. The nights grew heavier, the betrayals cut deeper, but none of it could change the date heaven had already circled on your suffering. When God says enough, no enemy can prolong the storm, and that day came. You endured the final stretch. You refused to quit, even when quitting felt easier. And now you stand on the other side, not only free, but forged. Understand this. Your survival wasn't just for you. It was a demonstration. Your endurance became a warning to hell and a revelation to others watching. You proved that suffering is seasonal, that despair is not permanent, that pain is not sovereign. You are living evidence that God sets boundaries even for darkness. So when you see the silence of your former mockers, don't confuse it with indifference. It's not indifference, it's conviction. They know what they did. They know how they treated you. And now they know God was watching all along. Their quiet is not peace. It is regret. As for you, your silence is no longer a tomb. It is testimony. You didn't just endure the deadline of suffering. You outlived it. And now your life speaks with a volume no ridicule can compete with. You are the proof that what was meant to break you only proved you were unbreakable. They thought no one was watching. They thought their lies, their betrayals, their manipulation were hidden in shadows. But God was in the room. He saw it all. Every word spoken in secret, every dagger disguised as kindness, every scheme cloaked as innocence. And heaven kept the receipts. Now the consequences have arrived, not as coincidence, not as karma, but as divine correction. Understand this, when people mishandle a chosen one, They are not simply offending a person. They are rebelling against divine order, and order always corrects itself. That is why their lives now feel like rubble, doors closing, peace evaporating, opportunities collapsing. They are haunted not by your revenge, but by heaven's justice. For God takes personally how his anointed are treated. But the real weight is this: in losing you, they didn't just lose a relationship. They lost a realm. You weren't common. You weren't replaceable. You were a bridge, a portal, a divine intersection. Connection with you carried access to favor, wisdom, alignment. They thought they could upgrade by discarding you, but instead they downgraded their destiny. They severed the very lifeline God sent to elevate them. And now, while others around you are rising because they honor what you carry, those who mishandled you sit stuck, watching elevation pass them by. This is the sting of divine recompense. It isn't just about punishment. It's about revelation. God is using your rise as a living lesson. He is preparing a table for you, not in secret, but in public view. Every blessing you step into is not just a reward. It is evidence. Evidence that favor cannot be faked, sabotaged, or silenced. Evidence that heaven's endorsement does not require human validation. That's the beauty of divine favor. It doesn't need a campaign, an argument, or applause. It shows up like light, undeniable and uncontainable. While they tried to silence you, God was positioning you. While they spread rumors, God was planting roots. While they mocked, God was multiplying. And now your elevation speaks louder than any defense you could ever make. This is why you don't need revenge. You don't need to prove them wrong. Favor does the talking. Favor is louder than every accusation. Favor is the courtroom where your vindication is displayed. And it doesn't whisper. It shouts, not from your mouth, but from your life. Look at your story. Every setback became setup. Every betrayal became redirection. Every closed door became a corridor into something greater. They thought they were burying you, but God was planting you. And now, in full bloom, your very existence is both healing and haunting. Healing for you, haunting for those who mishandled you, not out of spite, but out of correction. Because here is the eternal truth. God does not allow his chosen to be mocked without response. The price of mistreating a chosen one is not just regret. It is forfeited destiny. They didn't just lose you, they lost access to the breakthrough tied to you. And that loss cannot be undone by apologies or excuses. As you stand at your table, prepared, overflowing, radiant, remember this: it was never about proving them wrong. It was about walking in what was always yours. You are not rising to gloat. You are rising to embody purpose. And in doing so, your life has become a message. That favor needs no permission, no validation, no human approval. You are the proof. Your glow is the evidence, and the world will see it, because God has chosen to make your rise public.